Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about Australia. For a continent often perceived as a relatively new nation, historically speaking, its human story is the absolute oldest continuous cultural saga on Earth. When we think of ancient civilizations, our minds often drift to the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, or the sprawling cities of the Indus Valley. These are histories measured in thousands of years, perhaps 5 or 6 millennia at most. But Australia? The human footprint here stretches back over 65,000 years, a timeline so vast it makes the Roman Empire look like a fleeting moment, and the entire written history of the Western world a mere blink of an eye. This isn't just an interesting fact, it's a profound reframing of what ancient history truly means. It challenges our Eurocentric timelines and forces us to confront an astonishing truth. Humanity's most enduring cultural narrative didn't unfold in the Fertile Crescent, but on a vast, isolated continent at the bottom of the world. Think about that for a second. When the first Homo sapiens were carving tools in Ice Age Europe, the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians were already navigating complex marine environments, adapting to a continent unlike any other, and laying the foundations for a culture that would survive ice ages, megafauna extinctions, and millennia of environmental change. This isn't just a history of survival. It's a testament to incredible ingenuity, deep spiritual connection to land, and a sophisticated understanding of ecology that predates modern science by tens of thousands of years. It's a story of ancient migrations, of adapting to deserts, rainforests, and coastlines, of developing hundreds of distinct languages and complex social structures. This deep history isn't just a prelude to the Australia we know today. It is the foundation, the very bedrock upon which everything else rests. It's a story that reshapes our understanding of human capacity and resilience. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's rewind, not just centuries, but millennia. Our story begins not with flags or ships, but with the subtle, enduring ripple of human footsteps across an ancient landmass. For at least 65,000 years, the continent we now call Australia has been home to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, making theirs the oldest continuous living culture on the planet. This isn't just a claim. It's supported by archaeological evidence that pushes the boundaries of human migration and adaptation further back than many once imagined. The journey here was no accident, nor was it simple. It required a level of navigational skill and technological sophistication that reshapes our understanding of early human capabilities. Imagine a world very different from today. During the Pleistocene epoch, vast amounts of water were locked up in polar ice caps, causing global sea levels to drop dramatically. What we now know as Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were connected, forming a single supercontinent called Sahul. This massive landmass was separated from the Asian continent by a series of deep ocean trenches, collectively known as the Wallace Line. The first peoples to reach Sahul didn't just walk across a land bridge. They undertook a series of voyages, island hopping across treacherous open water, covering distances of at least 70 kilometres, about 43 miles, at a time. This implies the use of sophisticated watercraft, likely rafts or simple canoes, and an understanding of ocean currents and navigation that we often attribute to much later civilizations. The archaeological site of Majid Bebe in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory holds some of the earliest firm evidence. Stone tools unearthed there, precisely dated to around 65,000 years ago, show a unique technology not found in Southeast Asia at the time of migration, suggesting independent innovation and adaptation once they arrived. This wasn't a one-off journey. It was likely a series of migrations over thousands of years, with different groups arriving and spreading across the vast, diverse landscapes of Sahul. They encountered a continent teeming with megafauna, giant marsupials like the Diprotodon, a wombat-like creature the size of a rhinoceros, and formidable predators like Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. This was a wild, untamed world, and the first Australians swiftly began to make it their own. As these first peoples spread across Sahul, they demonstrated an unparalleled ability to adapt to radically different environments. From the arid heart of the continent to its lush tropical rainforests, from the icy peaks of the Tasmanian wilderness to the sun-baked northern coasts, every ecosystem presented unique challenges. Yet, within a few millennia, human populations had expanded into virtually every corner of the supercontinent. This rapid dispersal wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving. They developed distinct hunting strategies for diverse prey, from sophisticated fish traps along rivers to cooperative hunts for large game. Their toolkits evolved, incorporating ground-edge axes for forest clearing and specialized implements for processing plants and preparing food. One of the most enduring mysteries of this period is the fate of the Australian megafauna. By around 40,000 years ago, many of these colossal creatures had vanished. Historians and scientists still debate the primary cause. Was it the changing climate as the last ice age intensified, leading to increased aridity and habitat loss? Or did the arrival of humans, with their increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques and the widespread use of fire, play a significant role? The truth is likely a complex interplay of both. What we do know is that the first Australians became masters of their environment, not merely living within it, but actively shaping it. Their Quote 3, the controlled burning of landscapes, was a revolutionary land management technique. It cleared undergrowth, encouraged new plant growth that attracted game, and created a patchwork of habitats that increased biodiversity and made travel easier. This wasn't destruction. It was a profound act of ecological stewardship, passed down through generations. Their connection to the land went far beyond practical management. It was deeply spiritual. The dreaming, or chukurpa in some languages, is the foundation of Aboriginal spirituality. A complex system of belief that encompasses creation stories, moral codes, and the ancestral beings who shaped the land, its features, and its inhabitants. These stories are etched into the landscape itself, in rock art that dates back tens of thousands of years, like the stunning galleries of the Kimberley and Arnhem Land. These aren't just pretty pictures. They are living documents, repositories of knowledge, history and spiritual connection, often depicting ancestral beings, hunting scenes, and ceremonial life. The oldest known rock art in Australia, at Murujuga in Western Australia, dates back at least 40,000 years, making it among the oldest in the world. This art isn't static. It's a continuous evolving tradition, linking past, present, and future. As millennia turned into tens of millennia, the first Australians developed incredibly complex social structures. Kinship systems, far more intricate than simple family trees, dictated relationships, responsibilities, and marriage rules across vast networks of people. Trade routes crisscrossed the continent, exchanging precious ochre for ceremonies, stone tools, and even ideas. There was no single quote for, but rather a tapestry of hundreds of distinct language groups, over 250 at the time of European arrival, with around 800 dialectal variations, each with its own unique customs, ceremonies, and stories, all bound by a shared profound connection to their traditional lands. Then, around 10,000 years ago, a new era dawned, the Holocene. As the last ice age retreated, global temperatures rose and the massive ice sheets melted. Sea levels began to climb dramatically, slowly but inexorably separating Sahul into the continent of Australia, the island of Tasmania, and the island of New Guinea. This geological event fundamentally reshaped the continent's coastlines and had profound cultural consequences. Tasmania, once connected by a land bridge, became an island, isolating its Aboriginal population for thousands of years, leading to unique cultural developments. Along the new coastlines, communities adapted, developing sophisticated fishing technologies, like the ancient stone fish traps at Brewerina, some of the oldest human-made structures on Earth. This period saw an increasing regional specialization, with different groups developing distinct toolkits, subsistence strategies, and ceremonial practices tailored to their specific environments. In the arid interior, knowledge of water sources and desert flora was paramount, while coastal groups mastered marine resources. Social organization became even more nuanced, with elaborate initiation rites, complex moiety systems, ways of dividing society into two halves, and intricate ceremonial cycles that often involved travel and interaction between different language groups. The entire continent, from its deepest deserts to its highest mountains, was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a carefully managed, deeply understood landscape, cultivated and cared for by its human inhabitants for longer than any other people have continuously inhabited a single land mass. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this immense ancient history. The story of Australia's first peoples is one of unparalleled endurance, innovation, and a spiritual connection to land that defines their very existence. It is a testament to humanity's ability to not just survive, but to flourish in the face of incredible challenges for tens of thousands of years. But this vast ancient world was about to collide with another, far younger and radically different civilization. And that, of course, is a story for our next chapter, when the sails of European ships first appeared on the horizon. And so, this ancient world, a continent breathing with the wisdom of 65 millennia, found itself on the cusp of an encounter that would shatter its timeless rhythm. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of it. A civilization barely a few thousand years old, sailing across vast oceans, believing it was, quote, five, a land that had been intimately known, nurtured, and sung into existence by its inhabitants for longer than any European empire had ever dreamed of lasting. We're talking about a history so deep, so profound, that when the first European sails appeared on the horizon, they were not just encountering a different people, but an entirely different concept of time, land, and belonging. the first whispers of a southern land had long haunted European cartographers. A mythical terra australis incognita, a vast unknown continent needed to balance the world. But it wasn't myth that finally brought them. It was trade winds, ambition, and the relentless drive for new routes and resources. In 1606, almost 150 years before the Enlightenment truly took hold in Europe, a Dutch navigator named Willem Jan Zoon, aboard the Duifken, became the first documented European to sight and land on the Australian continent. He touched down on the western side of Cape York Peninsula, a place already home to thriving Aboriginal communities. We can only speculate what those first interactions might have been like. Brief, wary, probably mutually incomprehensible. Jan Zoon, mistaking the land for part of New Guinea, quickly departed after a skirmish, leaving behind no lasting impact, only a fleeting blip on a timeline that already stretched back into the mists of deep time. A decade later, in 1616, Dirk Hartog left his pewter plate nailed to a post on an island off Western Australia, a calling card to future mariners. Others followed, more Dutch ships, often blown off course by the roaring forties, charting fragments of the west coast, naming them New Holland. They saw desolate shores, encountered a few indigenous people they considered barbarous, and found no immediate riches. To them, this was a harsh, uninviting land, not the Spice Islands or gold mines they craved. They simply moved on, leaving this colossal continent largely undisturbed, a vast silent enigma in the European imagination. Then came Abel Tasman in 1642 and 1644, meticulously charting parts of the southern coast of what would become Tasmania and sections of the northern coastline. He mapped, he named, but like his predecessors, he left the continent's ancient heartbeat untouched. These early European encounters were like ripples on the surface of an ocean, momentary disturbances that barely registered in the vast depths beneath. The first Australians, the custodians of this land, continued their seasonal rounds, their ceremonies, their intricate management of country, largely unaware of these fleeting, pale-skinned apparitions. But the world outside was changing rapidly. The Enlightenment in Europe was fueling scientific inquiry, imperial expansion, and a burgeoning belief in the right to claim and civilize lands. And it was into this crucible of ambition and curiosity that James Cook sailed. We arrive now at 1770, a year that would irrevocably alter the course of Australian history. A time when a single ship, the HMS Endeavour, carrying a crew of scientists, artists and sailors, would unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that continues to resonate today. Cook, on a scientific voyage to observe the transit of Venus in Tahiti, had secret orders to search for the fabled southern continent, and he found it. On April 29th, 1770, after navigating the treacherous Tasman Sea, Cook's lookout sighted the eastern coast of Australia. Imagine the scene, the vast, unbroken sweep of green and gold, a coastline utterly unknown to the European world, yet intimately known to its inhabitants for tens of thousands of years. As the Endeavour sailed north, charting the coast, its crew observed smoke rising from numerous points, irrefutable evidence of human presence. This was not terra nullius, an empty land, but a continent actively managed, lived upon, and shaped by its people. Cook dropped anchor in a wide, sheltered bay, which he initially called Stingray Bay, but later renamed Botany Bay, captivated by the sheer abundance of previously unclassified flora collected by the ship's botanist Joseph Banks. This was the moment of collision. As the Endeavour approached, two Aboriginal men, members of the Gweagal clan of the Darawal language group, stood on the shore, armed with spears, watching these strange, enormous floating objects. Think about that for a moment. For 65,000 years, the largest vessels on these waters had been canoes, crafted from bark or hollowed logs. And now, a towering wooden ship, bristling with sails and unfamiliar rigging, filled with pale-skinned beings in peculiar clothing, had appeared as if from another dimension. How did they process this? As spirits? As invaders? As an inexplicable anomaly? Cook, determined to land, attempted to communicate. We have his journal entry describing the encounter. All they seemed to want was for us to be gone. The Gweagal men threw spears, not with lethal intent, but as a clear signal. "You are not welcome here." Cook's response was to fire a musket, wounding one of the men, and then to land, taking possession of their spears and shields. This was the very first act of what would become a brutal, centuries-long dispossession. The European perspective was one of scientific curiosity mixed with imperial entitlement. Banks marvelled at the unique plants and animals. Cook meticulously charted the coastline, claiming it for Britain. They saw a wilderness, ripe for development, seemingly untouched by, quote, 10, quote. They interpreted the absence of permanent dwellings or cultivated fields, in the European sense, as a sign of a primitive people with no claim to the land. They failed to comprehend the sophisticated, nuanced land management practices, these seasonal migrations, the deep spiritual connection that rendered the entire continent a living, sacred landscape. For the first Australians, this was an intrusion of an unprecedented scale. Their understanding of the world was holistic, interconnected, woven into the fabric of the land itself through the dreaming. Land was not property to be owned or traded, it was kin, ancestor, provider, and sacred trust. The concept of someone, Gastiek or quote 11, their country, let alone an entire continent, would have been utterly alien, nonsensical. Imagine the incomprehension. The Europeans, with their clocks and calendars, their written laws and maps, their guns and navigational instruments, represented a technological and conceptual paradigm radically different from anything the first Australians had ever encountered. Their ships, their clothes, their language, everything was alien. And in that mutual incomprehension, a tragic misunderstanding was born, one that would have devastating consequences. Cook spent 8 days in Botany Bay, then sailed north, carefully charting the entire eastern coast. He named this vast territory Quoti was 12. On August 22nd, 1770, on Possession Island, off the northern tip of Cape York, Cook formally claimed the entire eastern half of the continent for King George III of Great Britain. This act, performed by a single man on a remote island, was a declaration of sovereignty over a land that was already home to hundreds of nations, thousands of communities, and millions of people, each with their own laws, languages, and intricate social structures. It was an act of profound historical arrogance, justified by the legal fiction of terra nullius. How could a land be quote, 14, when smoke rose from countless hearths, when ancient songlines crisscrossed its vastness, when every rock and river held a sacred story? This claim, made without negotiation, without consent, without even a basic understanding of the people whose lives it would upend, marked the true beginning of the European chapter in Australia's history. It was a moment where two vastly different worlds, separated by more than just oceans, finally collided. One was a world of deep time, sustained wisdom, and profound connection to country. The other was a world of rapid change, imperial expansion, and a belief in its own inherent superiority. The seeds of colonization were sown. Britain, having lost its American colonies, was in desperate need of a new penal settlement. The vast, unclaimed land of New South Wales, with its distant shores and perceived emptiness, became the answer. And so, just 18 years after Cook's audacious claim, the First Fleet, a flotilla of 11 ships carrying convicts, marines and provisions, set sail from Portsmouth, England. Their destination, Botany Bay. They were bringing with them not just people, but an entire system of governance, law and land tenure that was utterly incompatible with the ancient systems already in place. The stage was set. The ancient enduring world of the first Australians, managed and understood for 65,000 years, was about to be overwhelmed by a radically different younger civilization. The ripples on the surface were about to become a tidal wave, forever altering the landscape, the lives, and the very spirit of this extraordinary continent. The true collision was imminent. 18 years. That's how long it took for Cook's audacious claim to ripen into a full-blown expedition. 18 years, a mere blink in the 65,000-year saga we've been tracing. Yet it was the precise length of time needed for Britain, reeling from the loss of its American colonies, to decide that this vast, distant land, this New South Wales, would serve a new, grim purpose, a penal colony, a dumping ground for its overflowing prisons, a place to send the unwanted and the unforgiven. So, in May of 1787, 11 ships, a motley armada of timber and sail, set forth from Portsmouth, England. This was the First Fleet, carrying over 1,400 souls, around 780 convicts, a contingent of marines, and a handful of officials, wives and children. Can you imagine the journey? 8 long months, traversing the vast, unforgiving oceans, a floating microcosm of British society, packed with hope, despair, and the stifling stench of human confinement. They were sailing towards a land they knew almost nothing about, a land already teeming with life, culture, and ancient stories. On January 18th, 1788, this weary fleet finally dropped anchor in Botany Bay, the very spot Cook had briefly surveyed. But what awaited them was not the idyllic harbour described in Cook's logs. The bay was exposed, the soil poor, the fresh water scarce. Governor Arthur Phillip, a man of remarkable foresight and determination, knew immediately this wouldn't do. He dispatched a small party to explore further north, and within days they found it. A magnificent deep-water harbour, sheltered and serene, with a fresh water stream flowing into a cove. Philip named it Sydney Cove, after Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary. On January 26th, 1788, a date etched into the contentious heart of modern Australia, the First Fleet weighed anchor one last time and sailed into Port Jackson. We often speak of this as the 16th of Australia, but we must remember it was the 17th of a British colony on Australia. For the first Australians, specifically the Eora Nation, whose ancestral lands encompassed this stunning harbour, it was something else entirely. It was an invasion. Imagine the scene through their eyes. a fleet of enormous silent "18", their sails like vast, white wings gliding into their sacred harbour. The Eora people, who had lived in harmony with this land for millennia, fishing its waters, hunting its forests, observing its rhythms, must have watched with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and profound unease. These weren't the fleeting visitors of Jansun or even Cook. These were hundreds upon hundreds of pale-skinned apparitions, disembarking with axes, saws, and shovels, immediately beginning to fell trees, erect tents, and establish a permanent presence. The clash of cultures was immediate and stark. The British, operating under the doctrine of a terra nullius, saw an empty land ripe for the taking, or at best, a wilderness to be improved by their superior civilization. They saw no fences, no farmed fields, no permanent dwellings, and therefore concluded there was no ownership, no prior claim. How utterly blind they were! The Eora people were the land. Their laws, their spirituality, their very identity were interwoven with every rock, every tree, every waterway. The land wasn't something to be owned. It was something to be cared for, a sacred trust passed down through generations. To build on it, to clear it, to disrupt its ancient patterns was an act of profound desecration. Initial interactions were tentative, often driven by a desperate need for resources on the part of the colonists, and an understandable wariness from the Eora. Governor Phillip, to his credit, initially sought to establish peaceful relations, even issuing orders against harming the Aboriginal people and advocating for their protection. He hoped to learn from them, to understand their customs. But the very act of establishing the colony was an act of war, an undeniable infringement on sovereignty. The British brought with them not just their culture, their laws and their muskets, but also something far more insidious and devastating: diseases against which the first Australians had no immunity: measles, influenza, and most catastrophically, smallpox. Within a year of the fleet's arrival, a virulent smallpox epidemic swept through the Eora Nation and beyond, decimating populations. It's estimated that between 50% and 90% of the Eora people perished in this horrific plague. Can you grasp the scale of this tragedy? Imagine a society suddenly losing the vast majority of its people, its elders, its knowledge keepers, its children. Imagine the terror, the grief, the incomprehensible loss. This was not an act of deliberate biological warfare, but its impact was no less devastating. It tore through the social fabric, eroded cultural memory, and left behind a traumatized, diminished population. The land, once vibrant with the songs and stories of its people, fell silent in many places. Yet, despite this unimaginable blow, the Eora people did not simply disappear or submit. Resistance was immediate and fierce. Pemulwuy, a Bidjigal man of the Eora Nation, emerged as one of the earliest and most iconic resistance fighters. For over a decade, from the early 1790s until his death in 1802, Pemulwuy led a guerrilla war against the encroaching British. He raided farms, attacked convoys, and ambushed settlers, often targeting those who had committed atrocities against his people. He became a legendary figure, both feared and admired by the colonists, who struggled to comprehend his resilience and his unwavering commitment to defending his land. The British saw him as a "20 outlaw." His people saw him as a hero, a freedom fighter. This period also saw attempts by the British to "21," or quote 22 Aboriginal people. Governor Phillip famously captured Bennelong and Eora Man in 1789, hoping to bridge the cultural divide. Bennelong lived among the British for some time, even travelling to England, learning English and European customs. He was a man caught between two worlds, a tragic figure who tried to navigate the impossible chasm that had opened between his ancient culture and the relentlessly expanding colonial power. His story, complex and poignant, highlights the immense pressure and confusion faced by the first Australians as their world was irrevocably altered. The colony, meanwhile, struggled to survive. The land, so different from verdant England, presented immense challenges. Early attempts at farming often failed, and the settlement teetered on the brink of starvation. Convicts, forced into brutal labour, built the infrastructure of the new colony: roads, buildings, and eventually farms. As the population grew, so did the demand for land, pushing the colonial frontier ever further inland, inevitably leading to more conflict, more dispossession. The British brought their entire legal system with them, imposing it on a land where complex and ancient customary law had governed for thousands of generations. They built courts, prisons, and gallows. They understood land ownership in terms of deeds and titles, fences and boundaries. The first Australians understood it as custodianship, as shared responsibility, as an unbroken spiritual connection. These were not just different interpretations. They were fundamentally irreconcilable worldviews, destined to clash. We see then the raw beginnings of a radical transformation. A continent that had evolved in relative isolation, shaped by the subtle and profound wisdom of its first inhabitants, was now confronted by a force that sought to dominate, to reshape, to impose its will. The first Australians, masters of adaptation and survival for tens of thousands of years, now faced the ultimate test: the survival of their culture, their identity, and their very existence against an uninvited, overwhelming tide. The legacy of these early years is complex and painful. It's a story of courage and cruelty, of misunderstanding and resistance, of unimaginable loss and enduring resilience. The seeds of conflict, dispossession, and systemic injustice were sown in those first few decades, seeds that would grow into the challenging landscape of modern Australia. The land, once a silent witness to millennia of human ingenuity, was now a battleground, its ancient rhythms disrupted by the clamour of a radically different civilization. And this was just the beginning. The continent, with its deep memory, was about to experience a history unlike any it had known before. The arrival of the first fleet, as we've seen, was not a singular event but the detonation of a slow-burning fuse. The initial skirmishes, the devastating smallpox, the defiant leadership of penal, the tragic dance of Bennelong caught between two worlds. These were but the opening acts in a drama that would unfold across a continent for over a century. We are now moving beyond the immediate shockwave of 1788 and into the relentless, grinding reality of colonial expansion. What happens when a fledgling penal colony, desperate for survival, begins to cast its hungry gaze beyond the confines of Sydney Cove? The British, you see, did not land on a blank slate. We know this now, though they chose not to then. They landed on a continent that had been meticulously managed, nurtured, and lived upon for tens of thousands of years. But their vision was singular: to establish a self-sufficient outpost of empire to feed its growing convict population and to exploit its perceived riches. And to achieve this, they needed land. Vast, sprawling expanses of it. The immediate surrounds of Sydney Cove, while providing a defensible harbour, were not ideal for large-scale agriculture. The soils were poor, the climate unpredictable. The colony was constantly on the brink of starvation in its early years, relying heavily on supplies from halfway across the world. This pressing need for viable farmland, for pastures to graze the sheep that would become the backbone of a future wool industry, pushed the colonists inexorably outwards. Imagine the pressure. You're a governor, responsible for thousands of souls, most of whom are unwilling exiles, all dependent on a distant homeland for sustenance. You look west, and you see the formidable barrier of the Blue Mountains, a seemingly impenetrable wall of sandstone cliffs and dense eucalyptus forests. For decades, these mountains were a psychological as much as a physical impediment, a symbol of the continent's wild, untamed refusal to yield. But the hunger for land, for expansion, for the very survival of the colony, was a powerful, insistent force. In 1813, that barrier was finally breached. A small party, Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson, found a route across the Blue Mountains, navigating the ridges and valleys, charting a path that would forever alter the trajectory of the colony. It was hailed as a triumph of exploration, a testament to British ingenuity and persistence, and in many ways it was. But for the Wiradjuri, Gundungura and Darug peoples whose ancestral lands lay beyond, it was the opening of a floodgate. Once the mountains were crossed, the land unfurled before them. Rolling hills, fertile river plains, seemingly endless pastures. It was precisely what the colony needed, and the push to claim it was immediate and overwhelming. Settlers, often ex-convicts or ambitious free immigrants, surged into the interior, driving their sheep and cattle before them, establishing farms and stations. This wasn't merely a peaceful expansion. It was an invasion, a relentless appropriation of land that has been Indigenous hunting grounds, ceremonial sites, and homes for millennia. This expansion ignited what we now refer to as the Frontier Wars. This wasn't a single organised conflict with declared battles and formal treaties. No, it was a brutal, protracted, and often undeclared war of attrition that spanned over a century and stretched across the entire continent. It was a mosaic of thousands of localised conflicts, skirmishes, massacres, and acts of resistance. On one side stood the colonists, armed with muskets, horses, and the unwavering conviction of their imperial right to the land. On the other were the first Australians, defending their country with spears, shields, incredible knowledge of the terrain, and a profound spiritual connection to the very ground beneath their feet. The disparity in weaponry was stark, but it would be a mistake to view this as a one-sided slaughter from the outset. Indigenous resistance was fierce, strategic, and often highly effective. Warriors like penal and countless others whose names are tragically lost to the colonial record employed guerrilla tactics, ambushing supply trains, spearing livestock, burning crops, and striking at isolated outposts. They understood the land intimately, moving silently through the bush, disappearing into the vastness, making the colonists' lives precarious and terrifying. They fought not for conquest, but for survival, for their homes, their families, their sacred sites, and their way of life. Yet, the tide of European settlement was relentless. The colonists, backed by the colonial administration and its military, responded to Indigenous resistance with overwhelming force. Punitive expeditions became common, often targeting entire communities in retaliation for attacks on settlers or livestock. Massacres, euphemistically referred to as, quote, 24 in colonial records, became a horrific feature of the frontier. We speak of figures like the Mile Creek Massacre in 1838, where 28 unarmed Wurundjeri people were brutally murdered by 11 stockmen, an act for which, unusually, 7 of the perpetrators were actually tried and hanged. But Mile Creek was not an anomaly. It was one of the few instances where justice, however imperfect, was pursued. For every Mile Creek there were countless other massacres, unrecorded, unpunished, and often deliberately concealed, that systematically decimated Indigenous populations. The impact was catastrophic. Smallpox, as we've discussed, had already ripped through coastal communities. Now, the relentless march of the frontier brought new diseases, alcohol, and the outright violence of dispossession. Indigenous communities were driven from their traditional hunting grounds, their sacred sites desecrated or taken over, their intricate social structures shattered. The very fabric of their ancient societies was torn apart. Imagine having your entire world, the land that defines your identity, your spirituality, your very existence, suddenly declared, quote, 25, quote, and seized by strangers who speak a different tongue, worship a different god, and have an utterly alien concept of land ownership. Perhaps nowhere was this conflict more intense and tragic than in Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania. Separated from the mainland by rising sea levels around 10,000 years ago, the Palawa people had developed a distinct and vibrant culture, living in harmony with their island home. But when the British established a penal colony there in year 1803, the confrontation was immediate and devastating. The island was small enough for the colonists to quickly encompass, leaving the indigenous inhabitants with nowhere to retreat. The Black War that ensued in Van Diemen's Land from the 1820s to the early 1830s was a period of horrific violence. Settlers, often armed and organised into vigilante groups, hunted indigenous people like animals, encouraged by bounties for their capture or even their scalps. The Palawa fought back with incredible courage and desperation, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and ultimately overwhelmed. The colonial response culminated in the infamous, quote, 27 of 1830, an attempt to sweep the entire indigenous population into a designated, quote, 28 on the Tasman Peninsula. It was a military failure, but a symbolic act of immense cruelty and futility, demonstrating the colony's intent to remove, if not eradicate, the original inhabitants. The official policy shifted from extermination to protection and civilization, but the outcome was equally devastating. The remaining Palawa people were rounded up and forcibly removed to Waibalena, a mission station on Flinders Island where disease, despair, and the loss of their cultural practices led to further rapid decline. This tragic chapter led to the widely, though inaccurately, held belief that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people were entirely extinct. We now know this to be a profound falsehood, a colonial myth designed to erase a people. Palawa culture and people endured, against all odds, a testament to their incredible resilience and spiritual strength. Back on the mainland, the frontier continued its bloody advance. the British colonial project, fueled by imperial ambition and the insatiable demand for land and resources, was relentless. The vastness of the continent meant that the frontier was not a fixed line, but a constantly shifting zone of conflict, moving east to west, north to south, consuming indigenous lands with every passing decade, from the fertile plains of New South Wales to the pastoral lands of Victoria, the Queensland rainforests, the remote Kimberley, and the deserts of South Australia and the Northern Territory. The pattern repeated itself: arrival, dispossession, resistance, violence, and the systematic dismantling of ancient ways of life. We often look at this period through the lens of individual acts of heroism or villainy, but it's crucial to understand the systemic nature of what was happening. The British legal framework, resting on the fiction of terra nullius, provided the ideological justification for the seizure of land. It denied Indigenous sovereignty, dismissed their complex legal systems, and rendered their millennia-old connection to country invisible in the eyes of the law. This wasn't merely a clash of cultures, it was a clash of fundamentally irreconcilable worldviews, where one side possessed the overwhelming power to impose its will. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, the first Australians never truly surrendered. Their resistance took many forms: armed struggle, sabotage, the quiet defiance of maintaining cultural practices, the passing down of stories and languages, the sheer act of survival itself. They adapted, sometimes by necessity, engaging with the colonial system, sometimes by retreating to the most remote corners of their country, always by holding on to the deep spiritual wellsprings of their identity. The early decades of the 19th century thus laid the brutal groundwork for modern Australia. They established the patterns of dispossession, conflict, and the profound racial inequalities that would persist for generations. They cemented a national narrative that often celebrated colonial .33 while overlooking, or actively suppressing, the immense suffering and resilience of the continent's original inhabitants. As we move forward, we must carry the weight of these early chapters, understanding that the foundations of this nation were built on a contested landscape, watered by the blood and tears of a people whose ancient world was irrevocably, violently transformed. The stage was set for a long, arduous struggle for recognition, justice, and the reclamation of a history too long denied. The continent, once a haven of the world's oldest continuous culture, was now a battleground, forever changed, but never truly conquered. The echoes of the frontier wars, those localized yet relentless campaigns of dispossession, reverberated across the continent. We left you contemplating the profound injustice inherent in terra nullius, that legal fiction which rendered millennia of sophisticated human occupation invisible. But the British weren't just claiming land. They were building a new society, one fundamentally alien to the ancient rhythms of Australia. The initial fervour of settlement, fuelled by convict labour and a desperate need for resources, soon gave way to something far more transformative: the insatiable hunger for wealth. Imagine, if you will, the relative quiet of the early colonial outposts struggling to establish a foothold. Then, almost overnight, everything changes. The 1850s arrived, and with them the roar of a golden tidal wave. Gold. It was discovered in New South Wales and Victoria, and suddenly the sleepy penal colonies became magnets for fortune seekers from across the globe. We're talking about a demographic explosion that makes the initial arrival of the First Fleet seem like a mere trickle. Men, and increasingly women, poured in from Britain, Ireland, China, America and Europe, all desperate to strike it rich. What does this mean for the first Australians? It meant a catastrophic acceleration of the processes already in motion. The gold rushes weren't just about digging holes. They required infrastructure, food, water and timber. Settlements sprang up around the goldfields like mushrooms after rain, demanding vast quantities of land and resources. Forests that had been carefully managed for thousands of years were felled for mine shafts and settlements. Rivers once pristine became choked with silt and mining waste. The sheer scale of this transformation was breathtaking and devastating. Where before, the pace of colonial expansion might have allowed some indigenous communities a brief respite, the gold rush era offered none. The new arrivals, often desperate and with little respect for existing inhabitants, pushed relentlessly into new territories. They didn't just want the gold, they wanted the land around it for farming, for grazing, for towns. This period saw an intensification of the frontier wars, often unrecorded, often brutal. Indigenous groups, already reeling from disease and earlier conflicts, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the relentless, mechanical advance of a civilization driven by a new kind of fever. But it wasn't just gold that drove this relentless push. Even as the goldfields boomed and busted, another form of expansion was steadily claiming vast swathes of the continent. Pastoralism, sheep and cattle. To the European eye, Australia seemed an endless empty pasture, ripe for the taking. We saw a new breed of colonist emerge, the quote, 34. These were individuals who, often without legal title, simply occupied vast tracts of land, establishing sheep and cattle stations that stretched for thousands of square miles. Think about the audacity of this. To simply ride out, claim land that had been home to generations and declare it your own for your flocks. This wasn't merely economic expansion. It was a profound act of cultural erasure. These pastoral empires were built directly upon the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Sacred sites were fenced off, traditional hunting grounds became grazing paddocks, and vital water sources were monopolized. The careful, sustainable land management practices developed over 65,000 years were dismissed as primitive, and replaced with practices that rapidly degraded the fragile Australian environment. The conflict, though often less dramatic than large-scale battles, was constant and insidious. Dispersals, a chilling euphemism for massacres, continued throughout the 19th century as a means of clearing the land for livestock. We refer to these as the frontier wars, but it was often a war of attrition, of starvation, of disease, and of overwhelming force against a people fighting to protect their ancestral homelands and way of life. Resistance, though often localized and fragmented, never truly ceased. Indigenous warriors, with their unparalleled knowledge of the land, continued to harass settlers, protect their families, and disrupt the colonial advance where they could. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming odds is a testament to their deep connection to country. As the 19th century wore on, the official colonial approach to indigenous peoples began to shift, moving from outright warfare to what was termed protection. But make no mistake, this was not protection in the sense of safeguarding rights or culture. It was a system designed to manage what was tragically and incorrectly believed to be a dying race. The prevailing European scientific and social theories of the time, particularly social Darwinism, fostered the belief that indigenous peoples were inherently inferior, destined to fade away in the face of superior European civilization. This belief system led to the establishment of missions and reserves. Imagine being forcibly removed from your ancestral lands, from the very places where your dreaming stories were etched into the landscape, and relocated to a mission station. Here, under the strict control of missionaries or government agents, your language was forbidden, your spiritual practices suppressed, and your children often removed from your care. The stated aim was to civilize and Christianize indigenous people, to prepare them for integration into the fringes of colonial society. But the reality was often grim. Life on missions and reserves was characterized by poverty, disease, forced labor, and profound cultural loss. Yet, even within these oppressive environments, the resilience of the first Australians shone through. They found ways to maintain their languages in secret, to pass on stories and knowledge, to adapt and survive. The ancient cultural tapestry, though frayed and threatened, refused to unravel completely. It simply went underground, waiting for a chance to re-emerge. The legal framework continued to underpin this dispossession. Terra nullius wasn't just a claim, it became the bedrock of all land law in Australia. Indigenous people had no legal standing to claim their lands, no recognition of their prior ownership. They were, in the eyes of the law, trespassers on their own country. The British legal system, built on concepts of individual ownership and title deeds, simply could not comprehend or refused to acknowledge the ancient communal and spiritual connection to land that defined Indigenous societies. As the separate colonies of Australia began to mature, a new idea took hold: federation. The vision was to unite these disparate British outposts into a single sovereign nation. For the colonists, this was a momentous step, a declaration of identity and purpose. Debates raged over tariffs, railway gauges, and political structures. But in all these discussions about the future of a new nation, one voice was conspicuously absent, one people systematically ignored. The first Australians were not considered citizens. They were not counted in the national census. They had no voting rights. They were, in effect, rendered invisible to the very nation being built on their land. The foundational documents of the Commonwealth of Australia, born on January 1st, 1901, were drafted with no recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, no acknowledgement of the profound injustice that had paved the way for its creation. It was a nation built on a great forgetting, a deliberate exclusion that would shape its identity for generations to come. We see then a pattern of profound systemic injustice solidifying, from the initial acts of dispossession and violence through the gold rushes and pastoral expansion to the establishment of missions and the birth of a federated nation. The first Australians were consistently marginalised, dispossessed, and dehumanized. Their ancient sovereignty was not merely ignored, it was actively denied. This period laid the groundwork for a long, arduous struggle for recognition, rights, and justice, a struggle that, as we will see, continues to this very day. The new nation had been born, but its soul was already burdened by the unresolved trauma of its violent genesis. when Australia federated in 1901, forging a new nation from 6 disparate colonies, a profound paradox was cemented into its very foundations. On one hand, it was a moment of national pride, a coming together under a shared identity. On the other, it was an act of profound exclusion, a deliberate turning away from the continent's true ancient heritage. Indigenous peoples were not just overlooked, they were actively written out of the national story, denied citizenship, excluded from the census, and stripped of voting rights. The legal fiction of terra nullius, that empty land, was now enshrined in the very fabric of a modern state. So, where did that leave us? Or more accurately, where did it leave them? The first Australians whose ancestors had shaped this land for over 65,000 years. It left them in a state of systematic marginalisation, caught in the long, dark shadow of a nation building its identity on exclusion. The early 20th century in Australia was defined by a policy known as the White Australia policy. While primarily aimed at restricting non-European immigration, particularly from Asia, its underlying philosophy of racial purity cast a pall over everything. It wasn't just about who couldn't come in. It was about who didn't belong, who wasn't considered Australian in the emerging national consciousness. Indigenous Australians, the original inhabitants, found themselves at the very bottom of this rigid racial hierarchy, often seen as a problem to be managed, or worse, a dying race destined to fade away. This wasn't just an abstract legal position. It was enforced through a pervasive system of, quote, 44 protection boards and various Aboriginal acts, administered by the states, held almost absolute power over the lives of Indigenous people. Imagine, if you will, a government body that could dictate where you lived, whom you married, what job you took, how much you were paid, and even whether you could leave a reserve or mission. This wasn't some dystopian novel. This was the lived reality for generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They were wards of the state, their autonomy stripped away, their fundamental human rights denied. Life on the missions and reserves established by these protectionist policies was often harsh and controlled. Traditional languages were suppressed, cultural practices forbidden, and children were often punished for speaking their mother tongue. The aim was assimilation, to civilize Indigenous people, to make them white in all but skin colour, or failing that, to simply manage their decline until they were, as the prevailing racist ideology suggested, no more. It was a policy born of paternalism and prejudice, a tragic belief that the best thing for Indigenous people was to cease being Indigenous. But the most devastating manifestation of this protection policy, the one that tore at the very heart of families and communities, was the forcible removal of children from their parents. This is the story of the stolen generations. Beginning in the late 19th century and intensifying throughout the 20th, tens of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were taken from their families by government agencies and church missions. Can you conceive of a policy so cruel, so utterly devoid of empathy, yet justified by those in power as being for their own good? Children were deemed neglected or at risk simply because they were Indigenous, living in traditional ways, or because their parents were seen as unfit by white standards. These children, many just toddlers, were placed in institutions, foster homes, or adopted by white families, often hundreds or thousands of miles from their ancestral lands. Their names were changed, their languages silenced, their cultural heritage deliberately erased. They were taught to reject their Indigenous identity, told their parents didn't want them, or that their culture was primitive and inferior. The aim, chillingly articulated by some policymakers, was to, quote, 52 of the Aboriginal race, or even more disturbingly, to, quote, 53% over generations. It was an attempt at cultural genocide, a systematic dismantling of family structures and cultural continuity. The trauma inflicted by the stolen generations is almost immeasurable. Imagine the terror of a child being snatched from their mother's arms, the agonizing grief of parents who would never see their children again, the profound identity crisis of adults who grew up not knowing who they were, where they came from, or even their own names. This was not a singular event. It was a sustained policy that created intergenerational trauma that continues to reverberate through Indigenous communities today. It fractured families, severed connections to land and language, and left deep wounds of mistrust and sorrow. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, the spirit of the first Australians refused to be extinguished. Resistance, though often subtle and under the radar, continued. As the 20th century progressed, a new form of activism began to emerge. Indigenous leaders, often those who had experienced the harshness of the protection system firsthand, started to organise. Figures like William Cooper, a Yorta Yorta man, campaigned tirelessly for Aboriginal rights, advocating for citizenship and land. He founded the Australian Aborigines League in 1933, a crucial step in formalising Indigenous political action. Others, like William Ferguson of the Aborigines Progressive Association, joined the chorus, demanding recognition and justice. This growing activism culminated in a pivotal moment on January 26, 1938, the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the First Fleet. While white Australia celebrated, quote, 55, Indigenous leaders and their allies gathered in Sydney for a, quote, 56. It was a powerful counter-narrative, a stark reminder that for Indigenous Australians, this anniversary was not a celebration, but a day of profound loss and dispossession. They issued a manifesto, quote, 57, quote, demanding full equality and an end to the oppressive policies that controlled their lives. It was a defiant declaration that they were not a, quote, 58, quote, but a vibrant, enduring people with rights that must be recognised. Beyond the nascent political movements, another powerful testament to Indigenous resilience emerged during the global conflicts of the 20th century. Despite being denied citizenship, despite enduring systemic discrimination at home, thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women volunteered to serve Australia in World War I and World War II. They fought bravely on battlefields far from their homeland, often facing discrimination even within the armed forces, yet serving with distinction and courage. Think about that irony. Fighting for a nation that refused to acknowledge their basic humanity, a nation that continued to strip their families and communities of their rights and dignity. When these servicemen and women returned home, often decorated for their bravery, they were met not with gratitude and equality, but with the same segregation, the same lack of rights, the same policies that governed their lives before the war. However, their experiences abroad, fighting alongside non-Indigenous Australians and encountering different societies, often instilled a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the injustices they faced. The global shifts post-World War II, with the rise of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also began to create a new international context for challenging racial discrimination. Slowly, painstakingly, the relentless activism of Indigenous leaders, coupled with the growing awareness among some non-Indigenous Australians, began to chip away at the edifice of prejudice and exclusion. The long shadow of federation, with its terra nullius fallacy and its cruel policies, had stretched for decades, but the seeds of a new era of struggle and recognition were beginning to sprout, promising a future, however distant, where the first Australians might finally reclaim their rightful place in the national story. The ashes of World War II settled across the globe, bringing with them not just peace, but a profound shift in the very fabric of human consciousness. Suddenly, the world was talking about human rights, about self-determination, about the inherent dignity of every individual, regardless of race or creed. But here, on our ancient continent, the echoes of those grand pronouncements felt distant, almost mocking. For the first Australians, the nation they had fought for, bled for, was still a land where they were strangers in their own home, denied the most basic rights of citizenship. Remember how we spoke of the quote 60 and the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the very idea of nationhood? How they weren't counted in the census, couldn't vote, and were subject to laws that controlled every aspect of their lives, often relegating them to reserves and missions. This wasn't just a historical footnote. It was the lived reality for generations. Yet even in the darkest corners of oppression, the flame of resistance never truly died. It flickered, it smouldered, and in the post-war era, it began to roar. We enter now a pivotal period, a time when the voices that had been systematically silenced for over 150 years began to rise, not as whispers, but as a collective chorus demanding justice. The groundwork had been laid by earlier activists like William Cooper and the Day of Mourning in 1938. But the 1950s and 60s saw a new generation, emboldened by global movements and a growing sense of shared purpose, step onto the national stage. This was the era of the Freedom Rides, inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, where Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students rode buses into segregated country towns in New South Wales. Led by Charles Perkins, a proud Arrente and Kalkadoon man, these rides exposed the ugly face of racism and discrimination, segregated cinemas, pubs and swimming pools, to a national audience that had often preferred to look away. For many Australians, it was a shocking revelation, a mirror reflecting an uncomfortable truth about their society. But the fight wasn't just about social discrimination. It was about fundamental legal rights. Imagine, if you will, living in a country where your very existence isn't even acknowledged in the national count, where the federal government, despite its power, couldn't make laws for you, leaving you at the mercy of often draconian state laws. This was the reality for Indigenous Australians. The push for a national referendum became unstoppable, spearheaded by organisations like the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, FCATSI, uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists in a powerful common cause. And so, we arrive at 1967. A year etched into the collective memory of this nation. On May 27th, Australians went to the polls to vote on two key changes to the Constitution. The first would remove a clause preventing Aboriginal people from being counted in the census. The second would empower the Commonwealth Government to make special laws for Aboriginal people, effectively giving them national oversight and, crucially, allowing for more consistent and equitable policy. The Quote 62 campaign was a truly national effort, a testament to the growing conscience of a people. When the votes were tallied, the result was overwhelming. 90.77% voted Quote 63. It was by any measure a landslide. For the first time, Indigenous Australians were to be counted as citizens in their own land. It was a moment of immense symbolic power, a national embrace, a collective acknowledgement that the original inhabitants were, indeed, part of the Australian story. But let's be clear, while the 1967 referendum was a monumental step, it was not the end of the journey. Far from it. It granted citizenship rights, but it did not grant land rights. It acknowledged existence, but it did not redress the historical injustices of dispossession. The referendum opened a door, but what lay beyond it was a landscape still scarred by centuries of colonial policies. The next great battleground, inevitably, became land. For the first Australians, land is not merely property. It is the spiritual, cultural and economic heart of their existence. It is the repository of their dreaming, the source of their identity, the very essence of their being. To be dispossessed of land was to be dispossessed of self. Enter the Gurindji people of Wave Hill in the Northern Territory. In 1966, led by the visionary Vincent Lingiari, they walked off the vast Vesties cattle station, where they had worked for generations, enduring appalling conditions and meagre wages. This wasn't just an industrial dispute. It was a profound act of self-determination, a demand for their traditional lands to be returned. The Wave Hill walk-off lasted 9 years, becoming a powerful symbol of the burgeoning land rights movement across the country, attracting national and international attention. The early 1970s saw a surge in Indigenous political activism. In 1972, a radical and unforgettable protest took root on the lawns opposite Parliament House in Canberra. Frustrated by the Prime Minister's statement that land rights were impossible, 4 young Aboriginal men planted a beach umbrella in the grass, declaring it the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. This impromptu encampment quickly became a permanent fixture, a powerful and undeniable symbol of Indigenous sovereignty, a direct challenge to the enduring myth of terra nullius. It was a physical manifestation of a people refusing to be invisible, demanding a treaty, demanding self-determination. The political winds were shifting. In 1972, the Whitlam Labour government came to power, ushering in an era of social reform and for the first time a genuine commitment to Indigenous affairs. In a deeply symbolic and moving gesture in 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam poured a handful of earth into Vincent Lingari's hand at Wave Hill, officially handing back a portion of their ancestral land. Quote 65. Whitlam declared, quote, 66. It was a moment that brought tears to many eyes, a tangible recognition of a wrong, a glimmer of hope. The Whitlam government also passed the Aboriginal Land Rights, Northern Territory, Act 1976, which allowed for claims to unalienated Crown land in the NT, a significant legislative breakthrough. But even as progress was made, the journey was fraught with challenges, political backflips, and continued resistance from powerful mining and pastoral interests. The fight for land rights was far from over. It was just beginning to move into the legal arena. And that, my friends, brings us to another seismic moment, the Mabo decision of 1992. For years, the legal fiction of terra nullius, the idea that Australia was, quote, 67 before European settlement, had been the bedrock of colonial law justifying the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. But a courageous Torres Strait Islander man, Eddie Mabo, from Murray Island, dared to challenge this fundamental premise in the highest court of the land. His case, Mabo v Queensland, No. 2, was a decade-long legal marathon. When the High Court of Australia delivered its judgment on June 3, 1992, it sent shockwaves through the nation. The court ruled that terra nullius was a legal fiction, a historical injustice that was, quote, 68. It recognised that Indigenous peoples had, and continue to have, native title to their traditional lands, where that title had not been extinguished by subsequent government acts. Can you imagine the impact? For over 2 centuries, the entire legal framework of colonial Australia had been built on a lie, a denial of the sophisticated societies that had thrived here for millennia. Mabo did not overturn all land ownership, but it irrevocably changed the legal landscape, opening the door for Indigenous communities to claim native title over vast areas of the continent. It was a profound vindication, a legal acknowledgement of what first Australians had always known. This land was, and always had been, theirs. The subsequent Native Title Act 1993, while complex and often contentious, provided a framework for these claims. Yet even with these monumental legal victories, the deep wounds of history remained. The just quotus is 69. Those tens of thousands of Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families continued to live with the profound intergenerational trauma of separation and cultural loss. The stories of these children, now adults, were heartbreaking, an open wound on the national psyche. In 1995, the federal government established a national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. The inquiry's findings, published in 1997 as the, quote, 70 report, were devastating. It detailed the suffering, the abuse, the loss, and called for a national apology, among other recommendations. The call for an apology became a powerful national movement. Millions of Australians participated in, quote, 71, quote, events, and signed, quote, 72, quote, acknowledging the injustices. Finally, on February 13, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood in the Parliament and delivered a formal apology to the stolen generations. Quote, 73. He said, acknowledging the unquote 74. It was another deeply emotional moment, a public acknowledgement of historical wrongs that had been denied for too long. For many, it offered a measure of healing, a step towards reconciliation. But an apology, while crucial, does not erase the past. It does not rebuild broken families, nor does it close the gaps in health, education, and economic opportunity that still persist today. So, where does that leave us? We have journeyed through millennia of ancient ingenuity, across oceans with intrepid navigators, witnessed the clash of civilizations, and traced the long, arduous path towards recognition and justice. The story of Australia is one of unparalleled human endurance, a testament to the resilience of the world's oldest continuous living culture. It is also a story of a young nation grappling with its past, slowly, sometimes painfully, coming to terms with the profound legacy of colonization. Today, the conversation continues. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, a powerful call from First Nations peoples for voice, treaty, and truth, represents the next vital steps on this journey. It is a plea for constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament for a national process of agreement-making, treaty, and for a truthful reckoning with our shared history. The ancient continent, our Sahul, continues to whisper its stories through the land, through the art, through the enduring cultures of its first peoples. The history we are uncovering together is not just a chronicle of events, it is a living, breathing narrative, still unfolding, still demanding our attention, our respect, and our commitment to a more just future. The dawn of justice has broken, but the sun is still rising, casting long shadows of the past even as it illuminates the path forward. We left off with an invitation, didn't we? An invitation etched in the very heart of this continent, born from the deepest aspirations of its first peoples, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It was 2017 when this profound document, a culmination of decades of struggle and dialogue, was delivered to the Australian people. It wasn't just a petition, it was a generous offering, a pathway toward a better future for all of us, built on the solid ground of voice, treaty, and truth. You see, for millennia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had spoken for themselves through their elders, their law, their art, their very presence on this land. But in the colonial construct, their voices were systematically silenced, ignored, or distorted. The Uluru Statement sought to rectify this, to embed a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution, a permanent advisory body to Parliament and government on policies and laws relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A simple, yet revolutionary idea. Give people who have lived on this land for over 65,000 years a say in their own destiny. A voice that cannot be unpicked by political whims. Imagine, if you will, a nation finally listening, truly listening, to the wisdom and experience born of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. What possibilities might unfold? What injustices might be righted? What profound insights might reshape our collective future? This was the promise of the voice. But the journey from invitation to implementation proved to be a winding, often treacherous path. The proposal for a constitutionally enshrined voice ignited a national conversation, a fierce and passionate debate that pulled at the very fabric of our identity. For some, it was a long overdue act of recognition, a step toward true reconciliation. They saw it as an opportunity to address the enduring disparities in health, education, and incarceration rates that continue to plague First Nations communities. Disparities that stem directly from the dispossession and trauma of colonization. They argued that a voice, designed and led by Indigenous people, would lead to more effective, culturally appropriate policies, bridging the chasm between intention and outcome. For others, however, the concept raised questions, anxieties, and even fears. Was it a third chamber of Parliament? Would it divide the nation? Was it fair to give one group a special voice? These questions, often fueled by misinformation and a deep-seated resistance to change, became the battleground of public opinion. The beauty of the Uluru Statement's simplicity, a voice, advisory only, yet constitutionally protected, was often lost in the noise. The Uluru Statement also called for treaty and truth. While the national focus for a time became fixated on the voice, the twin pillars of treaty and truth-telling continued their slower, more incremental progress. What does treaty truly mean in a nation that was never ceded? It means a formal agreement, a coming together of sovereign peoples to define the terms of their coexistence, to acknowledge the past, and to chart a shared future. It means recognizing the inherent sovereignty that was never extinguished, despite the legal fictions of terra nullius. While a national treaty framework remained elusive, individual states began to forge their own paths. Victoria, for example, established the first People's Assembly, an elected body to negotiate a treaty, or treaties, with the state government. Queensland too embarked on a path to treaty, recognising that these agreements are not just about land and resources, but about healing, self-determination, and justice. These state-level initiatives, though not uniform, demonstrate a growing understanding that the conversation cannot wait, that the work of addressing historical injustices must continue, even if the national consensus is yet to fully coalesce. And then there is, quote, 76, quote, perhaps the most challenging yet most essential of the Uluru Statement's calls. Truth-telling is not about blame. It is about acknowledging the full, unvarnished history of this continent since 1788. It's about confronting the frontier wars, the massacres, the dispossession, the stolen generations, the systemic racism that continues to impact First Nations lives. It's about understanding the profound spiritual, cultural, and environmental damage wrought by colonization. Imagine a nation grappling with its past with the same rigour and honesty it applies to other historical events. What would that look like? It might involve national truth-telling commissions, similar to those seen in other post-colonial nations, where stories are shared, records are examined, and the full scope of historical trauma is brought into the light. It might mean a radical re-evaluation of how we teach Australian history in our schools, ensuring that the First Nations perspective, their resilience, their ingenuity and their suffering are central to the narrative. It means acknowledging that the prosperity of modern Australia was built, in part, on the dispossession and suffering of its original inhabitants. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a necessary one for genuine healing and reconciliation. In October 2023, the nation was asked to vote in a referendum on the proposed constitutional amendment for the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It was a moment of profound significance, a chance to either embrace the invitation from Uluru or to decline it. The campaign leading up to the vote was intense, polarising, and at times deeply divisive. Ultimately, the proposal was rejected by the majority of Australian voters. The outcome was a moment of deep disappointment and heartbreak for many First Nations peoples and their allies, a stark reminder of the enduring challenges in achieving meaningful recognition and justice. It underscored the vast chasm that still exists between the aspirations of First Nations peoples and the understanding and willingness of the broader Australian community to embrace systemic change. The no vote, while a democratic decision, left many questioning the path forward and what it meant for the nation's commitment to reconciliation. It was a moment of profound reflection, a raw exposure of the nation's unfinished business. Yet, To understand the history of this continent, you must understand the unyielding resilience of its first peoples. The no vote did not diminish their spirit, nor did it silence their voices. If anything, it galvanized a renewed determination. The call for voice, treaty, and truth remains perhaps now more urgent than ever. In the wake of the referendum, the focus has shifted, but the work continues. Many First Nations leaders and communities have emphasized that while a constitutional voice may have been rejected, the need for Indigenous-led bodies to advise government remains paramount. The imperative for self-determination has not faded. Indeed, it has been strengthened. We see this resilience in the ongoing cultural revival across the continent. Language programs are flourishing, breathing new life into ancient tongues that were once on the brink of extinction. Art centres buzz with creativity, sharing stories and traditions that have been passed down through countless generations. Indigenous businesses are thriving, building economic independence and creating opportunities within their communities. First Nations scientists, artists, lawyers, doctors, and educators are leading in every field, proving that the ancient wisdom of this land is not just historical, but profoundly relevant to our present and future. Despite the setbacks, the journey towards reconciliation is not a linear one. It is a complex, often painful and deeply human endeavour. It requires patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. It demands that we, as a nation, continue to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past and present. It asks us to challenge the systemic racism that continues to manifest in alarmingly high rates of Indigenous incarceration, in health disparities that are a national shame, and in the ongoing struggle for equitable access to education and economic opportunity. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, even with the rejection of the voice, stands as a beacon. It is a testament to the enduring hope and generosity of the First Peoples of Australia, a blueprint for a future where their sovereignty is respected, their wisdom is heard, and their rightful place at the heart of this nation is truly acknowledged. So, where do we stand now, you might ask? We stand at a crossroads, still grappling with the profound implications of our shared history. The invitation from Uluru remains open, a constant reminder of the unfinished business of this nation. The path to treaty and truth continues to be forged, sometimes slowly, sometimes with renewed urgency, in communities and parliaments across the country. The story of Australia is not just a history, it is a living, breathing narrative, constantly being written by the actions we take today. It is a story of deep time and profound connection, of immense beauty and heartbreaking loss, and of an enduring spirit that refuses to be broken. It is a story that calls on all of us, First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians alike, to listen, to learn, and to walk together towards a future where justice, respect, and self-determination are not just aspirations, but lived realities for the first peoples of this ancient and remarkable continent. The journey continues. October 14th, 2023, a date now etched into the recent history of this continent. A moment when the nation was asked to walk a step further on the path toward recognition and justice. We, as a collective, were invited to enshrine an Indigenous voice in our Constitution, to give First Nations peoples a direct say in policies that affect their lives. The invitation, extended with such profound generosity through the Uluru Statement from the Heart, was met with a resounding no. The silence that followed, for many, was deafening. For First Nations peoples, it was a familiar echo of a history replete with denial, dismissal, and the deferment of justice. For those who had championed the voice, it was a deep disappointment, a moment of profound national introspection. Where do we go from here, you might ask? Does the rejection of the voice mean the end of the journey toward a more just and equitable Australia? To answer that, we must remember the vastness of the history we've been exploring, the enduring strength of a culture that has weathered far greater storms. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, that powerful and poetic invitation, remains. Its call for voice treaty truth is not a fleeting political campaign. It is a foundational blueprint, a roadmap to a reconciled future, meticulously crafted by First Nations leaders. The rejection of one part of that invitation does not invalidate the whole. Instead, it places an even greater emphasis on the other pillars, particularly truth and treaty. Let's talk about truth. If we, as a nation, struggle to embrace the concept of a voice, a mechanism for listening, then perhaps we have not yet truly heard the full story. Truth-telling is not merely an academic exercise. It is the essential bedrock upon which any meaningful reconciliation must be built. It requires us to confront the uncomfortable, often brutal realities of our shared past. It demands that we look squarely at the consequences of terra nullius, that legal fiction which denied the existence and sovereignty of the first Australians. It asks us to acknowledge the frontier wars, not as isolated skirmishes, but as a century of sustained conflict, massacres, and resistance across the continent. Do you know the names of the massacres that occurred in your region? Are you aware of the traditional owners of the land you stand on and the stories of their displacement? These are not questions designed to shame, but to awaken. Truth-telling is about shedding the comfortable myths and embracing the full, complex narrative. It's about understanding that the prosperity of modern Australia was, in many ways, built upon the dispossession and suffering of its first peoples. It means acknowledging the intergenerational trauma inflicted by policies like the stolen generations, the ripple effects of which continue to be felt today. This truth-telling must manifest in tangible ways. It means ensuring that our education systems teach a comprehensive and unvarnished history of Australia, from the 65,000 years of continuous culture to the impact of colonisation. It means re-examining place names, monuments and public spaces, ensuring they reflect the true history and honour the first Australians. It means supporting Indigenous-led initiatives that document and share their histories, languages and cultural knowledge, making them central to the national story, not relegated to the margins. Consider the metaphor of a family history. If a family has a painful secret, a significant injustice that has never been acknowledged, can they truly move forward in health and harmony? The truth, however difficult, is the path to healing. For Australia, our national family history holds many such unacknowledged truths. To refuse to engage with them is to remain stuck, to perpetuate the very divisions we claim to want to overcome. And then there is treaty. In the wake of the voice referendum, the focus on treaty has intensified. Australia stands almost alone among settler colonial nations in not having a treaty or treaties with its Indigenous peoples. You see treaties in Canada, in New Zealand, in the United States, agreements that, however imperfectly implemented, acknowledge prior occupation, sovereignty, and specific rights. Why not Australia? A treaty, or a framework of treaties, would fundamentally reset the relationship between First Nations peoples and the Australian state. It is not about turning back the clock, but about building a new foundation for the future, one based on mutual respect and shared sovereignty. What might a treaty entail? It could recognise First Nation sovereignty, establish self-determination, provide for land rights and resources, and ensure economic justice. It could address historical grievances, establish dispute resolution mechanisms, and guarantee cultural protection. The path to treaty is not simple. It is complex, requiring deep negotiation, trust building, and a willingness to confront power imbalances. There are many models and approaches, from national frameworks to regional agreements, tailored to the specific nations and their lands, but the core principle remains: a formal, legally binding agreement that establishes a just and enduring relationship, one that moves beyond the paternalism of the past and into an era of genuine partnership. The rejection of the voice has paradoxically highlighted the urgent necessity of these conversations. It has stripped away any illusion that reconciliation can be achieved through symbolic gestures alone. It has underscored that the profound yearning for justice, recognition, and self-determination among First Nations peoples is unwavering, and the work of voice treaty truth continues, driven by an ancient, unyielding spirit. This enduring spirit is the very essence of the erst Australians, the descendants of those ingenious navigators who first crossed the seas to Sahul over 65,000 years ago. Their resilience is not a recent phenomenon. It is woven into the very fabric of their being, honed over millennia of adapting to one of the world's most challenging continents. They survived ice ages, dramatic climate shifts, and the arrival of radically different civilizations. The no vote, while a blow, is but a fleeting moment in the vast continuous song of their culture. We see this resilience in the vibrant cultural resurgence unfolding across the continent. Languages, once suppressed to the brink of extinction, are being revitalized through community-led programs. Ancient stories are being retold, dances are being performed, and art is flourishing, connecting generations to their ancestral heritage. Indigenous businesses are thriving, asserting economic self-determination and creating pathways for their communities. First Nations leaders continue to advocate for their rights on national and international stages, their voices clear and strong, even when ignored at home. The deep spiritual connection to country, to the dreaming, remains the bedrock of this resilience. The land, for First Nations peoples, is not merely property, it is kin, a living entity imbued with ancestral stories, lore, and identity. This profound relationship has always guided their stewardship, their sustainable practices, and their very existence. And it is this connection that sustains them through every challenge, every setback. So, what is our role in this ongoing journey, you might ask? For those of us who are not First Nations, our role is to listen, to learn, and to walk alongside. It is to educate ourselves and others about the true history of this continent, to challenge racism and injustice wherever we encounter it, and to advocate for the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in all its facets. It is to understand that a truly reconciled Australia is one where the oldest living culture on Earth is not just acknowledged, but celebrated, respected, and empowered. The future of this continent, this ancient land we call Australia, depends on how we collectively choose to engage with its past. Will we continue to shy away from the uncomfortable truths, or will we embrace them as the foundation for a stronger, more honest nation? Will we delay the essential work of treaty, or will we find the courage and wisdom to negotiate a truly shared future? The journey is long, and the path is not always clear. But the call from the heart, the invitation to quote 84, still echoes across the land. It is a persistent, powerful song, sung for over 65,000 years, a song of survival, resilience, and an unwavering hope for justice. And it is a song that continues to call us all to a deeper understanding, a more profound respect, and ultimately a more unified future for all who call this extraordinary continent home. The story of Australia is far from over. Indeed, the most crucial chapters are still being written by all of us, together. We left off, didn't we, with a moment that felt to many like a deep national sigh, a collective holding of breath that ultimately exhaled disappointment. The 2023 referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament, an invitation from the heart of the continent to walk together, was not accepted. It was a moment that underscored the profound chasm that can still exist between intention and understanding, between hope and outcome. But here's the crucial point, the one we must never lose sight of. This was not an ending. Far from it. This was, in a way, a recentering, a clarification of the path ahead. Because the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that powerful resonant appeal, offered not one but three pillars for a just future: voice, treaty, and truth. And if one pathway proved temporarily blocked, the others remained, illuminated with unwavering clarity. So, where do we turn now? If the collective national no to a voice felt like a setback, it also, paradoxically, sharpened the focus on what must come next. It pushed us as a nation to confront the fundamental, foundational work that still lies before us, the deep, often uncomfortable, but utterly essential process of truth-telling. Think about it. For generations, the story of this continent, as told in our schools and our public narratives, has been incomplete. It has been filtered, sanitized, and often deliberately obscured. We have, as a society, largely looked away from the full extent of the violence, the dispossession, the systemic destruction of cultures that have thrived here for millennia. When we talk about the frontier wars, do we truly grasp the scale of the conflict? Do we understand that these were not isolated skirmishes, but a continent-wide resistance against an invading force, lasting for over a century? Truth-telling, then, is not merely about acknowledging individual acts of injustice. It is about fundamentally recalibrating our national understanding of history itself. It is about recognizing that the prosperity and development of modern Australia were built upon foundations of Indigenous land, labour, and lives. It means bringing to light the countless massacres that occurred, not just in remote corners, but often within sight of nascent settlements. It means understanding the deliberate policies designed to dispossess, to assimilate, to breed out Aboriginality. It means confronting the devastating impact of introduced diseases, like smallpox, which ravaged populations with brutal efficiency, often before settlers even arrived in certain areas, clearing the land for their expansion. This is the hard truth, but it is also the liberating truth. For how can we truly move forward, truly reconcile, if we continue to build upon a foundation of partial narratives and convenient omissions? This journey of truth-telling is not a blame game. It is an act of national maturity. It asks us to sit with discomfort, to listen deeply to the oral histories and survivor accounts that have been passed down through generations, often in secret, for fear of retribution. It means engaging with the meticulous work of historians and archaeologists who are unearthing evidence of these hidden histories, corroborating what First Nations peoples have always known. It means seeing the land not just as a resource, but as a living archive, a sacred country that holds the memories of its people, their triumphs, their sorrows, their enduring presence. And as we embark on this vital process, we are also forced to reckon with the profound loss that accompanied colonization. Imagine, if you will, a tapestry woven over 65,000 years, rich with hundreds of distinct language groups, each with its own intricate knowledge systems, spiritual beliefs, legal frameworks, and artistic expressions. Then imagine that tapestry being violently torn, its threads frayed, its colours dulled. This is the magnitude of what was lost, or rather, what was attempted to be lost. But the incredible resilience of First Nations peoples means that much of this tapestry, though damaged, endures. Truth-telling, therefore, is also about celebrating what remains and what is being revived. It's about recognizing the astounding sophistication of Indigenous land management practices, the controlled burns that shaped the landscape, prevented catastrophic bushfires, and fostered biodiversity for millennia. Practices that we are only now, in the face of climate change, beginning to truly appreciate and desperately need to relearn. It's about understanding the complex astronomical knowledge embedded in songlines, the innovative engineering of aquaculture systems like those at Budj Bim, or the deep understanding of medicinal plants and sustainable resource use that allowed cultures to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. When you consider the longevity and adaptability of these cultures, suddenly the Roman Empire looks like a fleeting moment, doesn't it? Even the grand civilizations of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, with their monumental architecture, pale in comparison to the sheer temporal scale of human ingenuity on this continent. This brings us to the second, equally crucial pillar, treaty. If truth-telling is about acknowledging the past, treaty is about shaping a new future. Australia remains the only Commonwealth nation that has never entered into a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. Think about that for a moment. Every other settler colonial nation, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, has, however imperfectly, at least attempted to negotiate agreements with the original inhabitants of the land. These treaties, despite their flaws and often broken promises, at least provide a framework for a nation-to-nation relationship, a recognition of prior sovereignty. What would a treaty, or indeed treaties, for the Uluru Statement envisions a process of agreement-making across the continent's many sovereign nations, look like in Australia? It is not a simple question, and there is no single answer. But at its heart, a treaty is about formalizing a new relationship based on mutual respect, recognition, and justice. It would likely involve recognition of inherent sovereignty, acknowledging that First Nations peoples never ceded their sovereignty over their lands, waters, and cultures. Land and water rights, going beyond native title to address historical dispossession, possibly through reparations, land returns, or co-management agreements that empower Indigenous communities to manage country according to their law and knowledge. Self-determination, ensuring that First Nations communities have the power and resources to govern themselves, to make decisions about their own futures, their education, health, and economic development, free from paternalistic intervention. Cultural protection and promotion, safeguarding languages, sacred sites, cultural practices, and intellectual property. Economic justice, addressing the vast economic disparity that is a direct legacy of colonization through mechanisms that foster Indigenous economic independence and equity. The journey to treaty will be complex, requiring immense goodwill, patience, and a willingness to negotiate in good faith from all sides. It will involve intricate discussions with hundreds of distinct First Nations groups, each with their own unique aspirations and claims. It will be a process of listening, learning, and building trust that has been eroded over centuries. But imagine the power, the profound healing, and the national pride that would come from finally, after more than 230 years, forging a genuine agreement with the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. This is the work that lies before us now. The disappointment of the referendum has not extinguished the flame of the Uluru Statement. It has, if anything, made its call for truth and treaty even more urgent, more resonant. First Nations peoples continue to demonstrate an unwavering commitment to their cultures, their languages, their country, and their vision for a just future. We see it in the vibrant resurgence of Aboriginal art, in the determined efforts to reclaim and teach endangered languages, in the tireless advocacy for environmental protection, and in the growing numbers of Indigenous leaders making their voices heard on the national and international stage. The continent itself, vast and ancient, remains a silent witness to this unfolding history. Its deserts whisper stories of deep time, its rainforests hum with ancestral knowledge, its coastlines echo with the journeys of the first navigators, and we, all of us who call this land home, are now invited to listen more closely than ever before. We are at a pivotal moment, a chance to truly write a new chapter, not just for Australia, but with Australia's First Peoples. The path of truth and treaty is not merely a political exercise, it is a spiritual and moral imperative. It is the only way to truly honour the profound depth of this land's history, and build a future where all its stories are heard, respected, and woven together into a single, magnificent narrative of a truly reconciled nation. The question remains, are we ready to walk that path together? The choice, as always, is ours. The rejection of the voice for many felt like a profound setback, a moment where the nation hesitated, then stepped back from a historic invitation. We watched, didn't we, as the hopes of a generation, of many generations, were tested, and for now deferred. But if the long, enduring story of this continent has taught us anything, it's that a single moment, however significant, does not define the entire narrative. The Uluru Statement from the heart, that powerful, gracious plea for justice and recognition, was never just about a voice. It was a holistic vision, a three-legged stool upon which a truly reconciled nation could stand. Voice, treaty, and truth. So, where do we go from here? The path forward, illuminated by the statement, now shines its light with even greater intensity on the two remaining pillars, truth and treaty. These aren't just abstract concepts, they are the very bedrock upon which a new, stronger Australia must be built. They are the essential conversations we must now have, the profound work we must undertake. Let's begin with truth. What does truth truly entail in the context of a nation grappling with its past. It is far more than simply acknowledging that bad things happened. It is about an unflinching, comprehensive gaze into the mirror of our history, acknowledging not just the events, but their profound, ongoing consequences. For too long, the dominant narrative of Australia has been a selective one, a story often sanitised, romanticised, or simply incomplete. It's a narrative that begins with European arrival as a moment of discovery, largely glossing over the vibrant ancient civilizations that thrived here for tens of thousands of years. But the truth, as the first Australians have always known and continue to tell, is far richer, far more complex, and often far more brutal. It speaks of the frontier wars, not as isolated skirmishes, but as a prolonged, violent conflict that raged across the continent for over a century. We must grapple with the fact that these were wars of dispossession, fought on a scale that saw massacres, poisoning, and systematic violence against Indigenous men, women, and children. You might have learned about individual heroes or significant battles in other histories, but here we are talking about unacknowledged battlefields stretching from the first landing to the furthest reaches of the continent, where resistance was met with overwhelming force and where the human cost was immeasurable. Truth-telling means confronting the sheer scale of the dispossession, the theft of land, resources, and sacred sites that underpinned the rapid expansion of the colonial frontier. It means understanding that terra nullius was not merely a legal fiction, but a destructive ideology that justified the erasure of an entire people's rights to their ancestral lands, denying their very presence and sovereignty. It means recognizing the immense wealth built on this stolen land and the devastating poverty and disadvantage that became the inheritance of First Nations peoples. It also means delving into the so-called protection era, a period often framed with paternalistic intentions, but which in reality enacted policies of profound control and cultural destruction. We must face the truth of the stolen generations, the systematic removal of children from their families, severing cultural ties, inflicting intergenerational trauma that echoes through communities to this very day. These weren't isolated incidents of misguided welfare. They were state-sanctioned acts of assimilation, driven by a belief in the superiority of one culture for another, and a deliberate attempt to quote 90. And the truth isn't just about the violence and the loss. It's also about the extraordinary resilience, the unwavering spirit, and the enduring strength of First Nations cultures. It's about recognizing the sophisticated land management practices, the intricate kinship systems, the profound spiritual connection to country that survived against all odds. It's about celebrating the continuous resistance, the quiet acts of defiance, the tireless advocacy, and the cultural revitalization that continues to thrive. How do we undertake this monumental task of truth-telling? It happens in many ways. It happens through historical commissions, like those seen in other post-conflict or post-colonial nations, dedicated to uncovering and documenting the full extent of past injustices. It happens in our museums and art galleries, challenging old narratives and elevating Indigenous voices and perspectives. It happens in our education system, ensuring that every Australian child learns the full, unvarnished history of this continent, from its ancient origins to its complex present. It happens in our local communities, through shared stories, memorialization of massacre sites, and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we walk upon every day. This journey of truth-telling will be uncomfortable. It will challenge long-held national myths and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about who we have been. But it is only by understanding the full weight of our past that we can truly move forward, together. It is about building a shared understanding, a collective memory that acknowledges the pain and the triumph, the loss and the survival that have shaped this nation. It is the necessary prerequisite for healing, for justice, and for the next crucial step, treaty. Now let's turn our gaze to treaty, you might ask. Quote, 92, quote, "For Australia is unique among major settler colonial nations in the English-speaking world. Unlike Canada, the United States, or New Zealand, where treaties, however flawed or broken they may have been, were at least signed. Between the colonisers and Indigenous nations, Australia stands apart. The British Crown never entered into a treaty with the First Peoples of this continent. The land was simply taken, declared terra nullius, and occupied. This fundamental absence lies at the heart of much of the ongoing injustice. A treaty, or more accurately treaties, plural, would fundamentally re-establish the relationship between First Nations peoples and the Australian state. It would be a formal, legally binding agreement, or set of agreements, that recognise the sovereignty that was never ceded, and lay out the terms for a new, respectful coexistence. Imagine for a moment the significance of such an act, a nation finally acknowledging the prior ownership and ongoing rights of its first peoples, moving from a relationship of conquest to one of negotiation and mutual respect. But what would these treaties cover? The possibilities are vast, reflecting the diversity of the more than 300 distinct First Nations groups across Australia, each with their own history, culture and aspirations. They could address land rights and native title, moving beyond the current Native Title Act to provide more robust and equitable outcomes. They could establish mechanisms for resource sharing, ensuring that First Nations communities benefit from the wealth extracted from their traditional lands. They could enshrine cultural protections, ensuring the preservation and promotion of languages, sacred sites, and traditional knowledge. Crucially, treaties could also establish frameworks for self-determination and self-governance, empowering First Nations communities to make decisions about their own lives, their own lands, and their own futures. This might involve regional agreements, local governance structures, or even nation-to-nation agreements that recognise the inherent right of First Nations peoples to govern themselves according to their own laws and customs, within the broader framework of the Australian state. The path to treaty is not without its complexities. Who negotiates on behalf of the diverse First Nations? How do we ensure that agreements are truly representative and reflect the will of the people? What legal and constitutional changes might be necessary to enshrine these agreements? These are not simple questions, and they will require immense political will, sustained engagement, and a genuine commitment to listening and partnership from all levels of government and the broader Australian community. Yet, the significance of treaty cannot be overstated. It is about fundamental justice. It is about repairing historical wrongs not just with words, but with concrete, legally enforceable commitments. It is about creating a framework for a stronger, more equitable nation, where the rights and cultures of First Nations peoples are not merely tolerated, but are deeply valued and protected. It is about moving beyond the colonial legacy of conflict and dispossession towards a future built on shared understanding, respect, and agreement. Truth and treaty are inextricably linked. You cannot have a meaningful treaty without first engaging in a profound process of truth-telling. How can we negotiate a just future if we don't have a shared understanding of the past? Truth-telling lays the groundwork, revealing the injustices that need to be addressed, the historical context that must be understood, and the ongoing impacts that demand rectification. And treaty, in turn, provides the mechanism, the legal and political framework through which those truths can be acknowledged, addressed, and ultimately reconciled. The journey continues, long and winding though it may be. The wisdom of the Uluru Statement remains, a guiding star in the vast southern sky. It calls upon all of us to walk together, to listen, to learn, and to build a nation that is truly whole. The setbacks are real, the challenge is immense, but the opportunity before us to truly embrace the entirety of our history and to forge a future built on justice and mutual respect is perhaps the greatest gift we can offer to the generations yet to come. The oldest continuous living culture on Earth stands ready to lead, offering its profound knowledge, its resilience, and its vision for a shared destiny. It falls to all of us to answer that call.